Okay, today we have a special guest, professor at Xiamen University, where he teaches MBA students and is former academic director of the Global One MBA program. Dr. Brown arrived in China in 1988 and earned honorary citizenship of Fujian from Xi Jinping in 2001. He is
Yeah.
author of numerous books, including Off the Wall, How We Fell for China, How We Feel, I'm sorry. Oh, How We Fell for China, sorry. uh, Chasing the Chinese Dream, The Evolution of China's Anti-Poverty Strategies, and too many more to mention. Welcome to the bridge, Dr. Brown.
Thank you. That's a lot of stories, and some of them are true.
I think it's really interesting. Before we get started, if I might just say something a little silly, your name is Dr. Brown. Do people ever call you Doc Brown, as in Back to the Future?
No, in fact, they don't even call me Brown. They call me by my Chinese name, Pan, Pan,
Pan.
and Pan Weilian. Because Brown, they usually translate to Chinese Bulong, which sounds terrible. That's not a real name. So I have the name of Pan, but a lot of people think because my name is Pan that I'm Peter Pan, so they say Beta Pan.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Well, I was thinking Doc Brown because I guess I just grew up in the 80s
That
or
sounds
something.
cool.
It does sound cool. I thought it was very cool. I was like, oh, I'm kind of jealous. I wish I could be Doc Brown. Anyways,
I like
okay.
that.
So I'd like to learn a little bit about you, and I think our listeners would too. Could you tell us about your life back in the States and why ultimately you decided to move to China? This was in the 80s when no one was really moving to China. You really beat the curve.
Oh, a lot of people ask me that. And the truth is, I moved to China because I wanted to eat Chinese food every day. No, that's not the reason. Actually, when I was very young, I wanted to travel the world. I wanted to go everywhere, uh,
Hmm.
but not China. I first wanted to go to Australia. I even applied to move there, but they said I had to wait 10 years because they said you had to be at least 18. I was only 8. So I still haven't made it to Australia. Uh, but then when I was 20, the Air Force sent me to Taiwan. And I was sitting there for 2 years and I had no idea where Taiwan was. And then I found out it was across from mainland China. I thought, oh my goodness, I thought I'm going to go to war. I gave my car to my sister because I thought we'd go to war. I wouldn't come back. I did survive, but she never gave back the car. Um, but I didn't want to go to Taiwan. But within 2 or 3 weeks, I fell in love with the Chinese culture, the history, the language. So when I left there in 78, I said, someday I want to study Chinese. I'm going to go to mainland China, see the rest of the country, and study Chinese. That was 78 when I left Taiwan, but it took until 1988 to get to the mainland. But in 81, I left the Air Force, continued graduate school, and I met a girl who was born and raised in Taiwan. Blonde hair, blue eyed, American, but born and raised in Taiwan. Her parents were there 35 years teaching. And I said, I want to go to China and study Chinese. She said, oh, that's what I'm planning on. So we became best friends because, sorry about kicking that. We became best friends because of this love for China. And we got married in Taipei. And so for 7 years, it was just our dream to come to China. But I just wanted to come study Chinese. I didn't plan to teach. So I sold my business, came to China, but I was only going to be here 1 or 2 years. I never expected I'd be here 36 years.
Wow. 36 years. That's amazing. I understand from watching a couple other interviews that you were piqued about life in China's mainland by a leaflet that fell from the sky. Could you tell us a little bit about
Uh,
that?
I love that story because it really is Chinese say yuan fen fei, but I like to tell Chinese I got a letter from heaven inviting me to the mainland. And this is true because in July 77, I was outside on the Air Force Base, of all the places for this to go. A mainland balloon with propaganda leaflets came right over Taiwan, right over the Air Force Base in Taichung, CCK Air Force Base. I was outside walking in the afternoon, and all of a sudden it's like snow, all these leaflets coming down. And I looked at it, what is this? And then I saw it's propaganda leaflets. I figured it must be from mainland because the Taiwan ones would go to the other direction. So I wasn't interested because one, I wouldn't believe anything, it's mainland. Two, I couldn't read Chinese. But then the Taiwan police came running out and they said, don't look. You tell a 20-year-old American male, don't look. You want to look. I had no interest, but when they said, don't look, And they said, if you touch it, you go to jail. I thought, wow, this has got to be good
Wow.
stuff. So I tied my shoes and took 3 or 4 and tied the other shoe, took 3 or 4. I took about 12 or 14. I still have one here with me. And I went back to my room. I couldn't read it, couldn't understand it. But then I saw some photos and farmers. I spent a lot of time in Taiwan in the countryside with the farmers and the mountains of minorities. I love the people there. And I saw the photos and I thought, wow, these look just like mainland Chinese. And then I found out 3/4 of the people in Taiwan, their ancestors are from the mainland. I thought, well, both sides are Chinese. It just never really occurred to me. And that's when I got really curious. And I thought, someday I want to go to the mainland uh, because that's where
Wow,
most of China is. Taiwan's only a
yeah.
very small part of it. So that was what
Hmm.
got my attention. And I laugh about it now because when I first saw it, it's a propaganda leaflet, it's brainwashing. I didn't believe it, but actually it was pretty effective. Didn't matter what they wrote. I just saw the photo and that worked.
It got you to move here for 36 years. I wanted to ask you about this because over your right shoulder, there's a medal. Could you tell us what that medal is?
Oh, yeah, that's in 1993, Li Peng gave me the Chinese Friendship Medal. I became permanent resident in 92, and then the next year they gave me the Friendship Medal. So we went to Beijing for that, and that was pretty exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, those are pretty rare from what I understand. I only know a couple of other people who have those. It's my dream aspiration to someday get that medal as well. So I'm kind of envious when I saw that behind you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned coming here for 1 or 2 years. So could you tell us about your first weeks or months in China's mainland in Fujian, and also a little bit about why you began frequently writing letters to people back home?
Well, through the 80s, I mean, I left Taiwan in 78. My dream was to come to the mainland. And it's funny, this is also fate, fun, because now in Xiamen Island, I'm 100 miles directly across the strait from Taichung, where I lived in Taiwan. So I mean, right next. It took me 10 years to get 100 miles. That's a record for slow. But when I got here, through the 80s, I kept reading magazine articles and things about China's changes, because someday I'm going to get there. Of course, everything I read in Western magazines, China's just falling to pieces. And then I read the Chinese mainland magazines and everything is going great. And so I really wasn't sure what's going on. But when I finally got to Xiamen, we immediately saw that it wasn't like what we expected. From what we had read, everybody is sort of drab and gray and blue and oppressed and quiet and sad. And we found that people were actually pretty optimistic. It was poor, even here in Xiamen, which is so beautiful now. It was pretty backwards, electricity and water out all the time. But the people were happy because for the first time in 100 years, the country is at peace, stable, and life was better than they'd ever seen it in their time. And so I was pretty impressed. And then my friends were writing me saying how hard it must be for us to live there. It was. I mean, we had challenges. Um, but we'll give you an example of the challenges. One, the water was out all the time. This is Xiamen Island, now one of the best places, but water was out all the time, 3 or 4 days, sometimes no water. When we did have water, it was to call it coffee. Even the hospital put white socks on the faucets, tied them to act as a filter. The transportation was bad. I bought a three-wheel pedicab myself so I could get around town. They said foreigners can't buy commercial vehicles. I said, do you think I came to China all the way from the US to pedal a three-wheel bicycle to make money? And I remember they said, maybe we hear American economy's got troubles. It took me a whole month to get permission. Finally, the Xiamen University leaders wrote a letter and stamped it and said, Han Weilian is buying this bicycle for his family, not to do business. So they sold it to me. I very proudly pedaled it home. I didn't get 200 meters when a young guy on the side of the road yelled, he was with his girlfriend, he yelled, how much to Zhongshan Park? I thought, wow, this is great. If I can't learn Chinese, I'll just pedal this bicycle, go into business again. So, but we had
Yeah.
challenges like that. And the reason I came to Xiamen is it was the only university at the time that had housing for foreign students, that had families with them. So that's why we came here. And that's another fun thing too. Xiamen reporters sometimes say, why did you choose Xiamen? Why stay so long in Xiamen? And I say, I came to Shaman because I could not go anywhere else. That gets a nice response, but that was true at the time. I'm glad I came here, but um, and then because we were first, a lot of things hadn't been worked out. Like they said, we had to eat in the cafeteria, but we couldn't use cash. We had to use the ration coupons. I said, well, where do we get the ration coupons? They said, well, we can't give those to you yet. I said, I can't use cash, I have to use coupons, but you can't give me the coupons. How do I eat? And they said, well, Messiah, this is Milan dialect. We don't know. They were real apologetic about it. But what really moved me was some of the other teachers were really, I mean, everyone was tight back then. Some of the other students shared their ration coupons with us. I said, you won't have enough for yourself? They said, oh, no, we had plenty. I'm naive. I believe them. After about 2 or 3 weeks, they worked out the problem. And then I found out that even without sharing their ration coupons, they didn't have enough. They still shared them. And
Wow.
so I was moved by that. And then I went to the countryside because it was backwards, but still people were happy and positive. So I went to the countryside 4 or 5 days on bicycle, boat, on foot, bus, just to see what it was like there. And I spent the night with a farm family. They were pretty poor and they ate so well. I thought, wow, these farmers are doing pretty well. And I was a stranger. They didn't even know me. And about a month or two later, I found out that they had served me such nice foods because Chinese New Year was only 2 weeks later. And so they fed me things they had been saving for Chinese New Year.
Wow.
Wow. I mean, so I wrote home, I said, who wouldn't fall in love with people like that? So as I saw the situation, the challenges, the people were happy and positive, I thought, this is nothing like what my friends and family know. So I quickly began writing letters and just using a little humor because they didn't want to hear these things. I wrote some humor and yeah, I just wanted them to see what it's really like here because China's, if you know the history, they really suffered for a long time. And the media that I saw is still making it look like it's such an awful, terrible place. And I know a lot of problems happened, but by 88, it was a lot of changes. So I just wanted people to see the China I was seeing.
I understand you put a water tank on the side of a hill to provide running water. Is that true?
Yeah. Yeah. Because the water was out all the time, 3 and 4 days. And with a 6-month-old and a 2-year-old, and they have water out for 3 or 4 days. So on the mountainside, I built a reservoir up there, or not a reservoir, a big tank and a pipe to go to this building. There's 7 families here, and we use that. But yeah, and the electricity, I had 2 transformers in series to get the electricity up high. And the current was so low that we often couldn't even operate an electric fan. And we finally started getting microwaves. I was the first person, I think, in Xiamen to get a microwave. And one of the professors asked me, how long do you have to preheat a microwave? I said, not long. But the current was so low that if you turn on a hair dryer, which were rare then, the electricity, the lights would dim, not only in our building, but the 3 or 4 buildings near us, the lights would dim. And then when you turn it off, it'd flash back up and then burn out. So that was pretty crazy. The water and electricity were a real problem then.
Well, you've been here for 36 years, and obviously at the time that you were there in 88, things are dramatically different than they are now. Could you tell us what has surprised you most about the modernization process of China from the 1980s to your life now?
The thing that amazes me, and I didn't really appreciate this, that I saw the changes, and Xiamen changed very quickly, but in 2002, Xiamen asked me to help them enter an international competition for livable communities. And I said, well, I can't do that. My background's business, and I don't know anything about environmentalism, urban development, and all that. But they said, well, this is a communication problem, which I saw it was. So I spent 8 months helping them research, and then I put together a PowerPoint. And as I learned about it, I was so amazed at the degree of planning that the Chinese went into. And I saw where they made mistakes, but when they made mistakes, they backed off and learned from it because no other country has ever done so much so fast. And so as I began to understand just the sheer complexity of everything Xiamen was doing, Xiamen made some plans. And when I saw these plans, I thought, this is ridiculous. You're building a road here, a ring road there. You're building this giant thing in the middle of nowhere. And then I saw their 15-year plans. In fact, Xi Jinping had been here. He was here for 2 years, and he helped him do a 15-year plan. And I saw these plans, long-term plans. Then I understand what they're thinking, but I still was a little skeptical. I mean, when they started building it, there's nothing there. And then 10 years down the road, everything that they'd planned pretty much happened. And so I was so impressed by what Xiamen had done, and at the same time, and our mayor, vice mayor, our mayor and party secretary, later became party secretary, Hong Yong-shi, he said, we don't want to do like a lot of the rich countries did. We don't want to totally destroy our environment to get rich and then use our money to fix it. We want to try and balance growing and greening. And they did that. So when I went to Germany and gave the talk about Xiamen in 2002 in Stuttgart, afterwards we got the gold, and one of the 6 international judges said Xiamen is not only number 1, but number 2 is far behind. And I remember another judge, I forget where he's from, he said he had no idea that China had cities like this. But I thought it was just special, just Xiamen. Of course, I'm very partial to Xiamen. But then I was asked to help other cities. I ended up helping about a dozen cities. All but one got the gold. One got silver, but the others got gold. In every city, I was just amazed at how well they did. And so what impressed me is that it's just really scientific. And the people running the government, though, it reminds me a bit of ancient China, because in ancient China, if you want to be a government leader, you had to pass the imperial exam, which is the old Gaokao, and you had to have an educational foundation. But people say that killed their creativity. But then when you read history, in ancient China or today, the same, these countries being run by engineers. And so once they face problems or opportunities, they know how to think, and they work together in committee, and they just do these things. And I know they have politics and all that here, like everywhere, but to me, it's just very scientific and logical the way they do things. And I've been all over China. I drove all over China just to see, is it just on the coast or just one area? It's pretty impressive.
Actually, your story reminds me of my own story. And about 2012, I noticed in the countryside here in Beijing, there was a subway, like in the middle of nowhere. There, cornfields and stuff, no buildings around at all. And there's a subway popping out in the middle of the countryside. And I was like, I wonder why this is here. And just a few years later, there were buildings all around it, and, malls and new development. It's like all the planning before they even built the community, all the infrastructure is already built out. It is quite remarkable because, in our home country in the United States, you would build the town first, and then the infrastructure to facilitate that would come later. So it's kind of the reverse a little bit.
But if you build the town first, then build that infrastructure, you have to move so much, get so much permission, buy so much. Yeah. So by doing that, by laying the groundwork first, that's really smart. It avoided a lot of problems. And it's not like in America, they think Chinese government will just do anything they want and move people off their land and their farms. And all. It's not so simple. Well, we had a development right here by Xiamen University, and they had to delay like 3 years because one person wouldn't sell their house. But they finally did it.
Actually, that's the experience of my Chinese wife's parents. They live in prime real estate in the middle of their city of 7 million people in Shandong. And there are developers who want to develop that, but they're holding out for a better deal. So they've just been living there for several years while the developers are trying to figure out how to pay them enough to get them to move out. I want to move on, because you did meet Xi Jinping. He gave you an award in Fuzhou in 2001. I was wondering if you could tell us about your experience of meeting the president of China before he became the president.
Well, one thing is, I would have never imagined then that he would be president, but after he became president, I could see why, because he is such a methodical person. But I had seen him a few times before that provincial government meetings, but he was always so quiet, low key. And he didn't talk unless he really had something to say, but he asked a lot of questions. And even then, he wouldn't give his opinion on things until he was really sure of the situation. And so, such a quiet person, in America, I'm used to American politicians, rah, rah, rah. Hard to imagine somebody like him as the president. But he did so many things while he was here in Fujian that now, when he was young, these projects and anti-poverty programs and things that he developed, environmental philosophies and practices, working with minorities, and these things are now national. So I could see why he became president. But what really moved me was, I mean, it was exciting in 2001 when I met him when he was governor, and he gave me the honorary citizen of Fujian, and and he and he also, and that's when he really encouraged me to write more books. And in 2001, at the dinner, he said, "You wrote about Xiamen, your second home. You should write about Quanzhou, your third home." So I didn't know Quanzhou was my third home, but I loved it. He knew I'd gone to Quanzhou a lot because Quanzhou was the start of the Maritime Silk Road. And that's where he got the idea for Belt and Road Initiative. So later I wrote that book and I helped them put that city. But what really moved me before that was in 99. In 99, I had cancer and I went to a Hong Kong hospital. I was supposed to be there 6 days, ended up 2 months, almost died a few times. It wasn't sure I was even going to come out. And some Americans visited me and said, if you get out of the hospital, are you going home? And they meant to go back to the US. And I said, well, if I get out, I want to go back to Fujian, Xiamen. But I thought, what will I do? Because I mean, my body was destroyed pretty much. And Xi Jinping somehow found out that I was in the hospital, and he sent 2 people to the Hong Kong hospital with flowers to say he hope I got well and returned home. And I just remember I was so moved by that. And then I started walking down the aisle every day, hauling my IDs and all this stuff with me. And but what's really amazing, that was 1999. In 2019, at the annual Congress, I haven't seen him since 2021, but at the annual Congress in 2019, the Fujian delegation met with them, and it's just a very brief time with each delegation. And he asked them, he said, "Is Bill Brown retired and how is his health?" It's 20 years later.
Wow.
And he wrote me a letter at Chinese New Year then. And I was just so moved by that because that's what I've gone to every place he's lived, where he was as a child, as a teenager, and a Chengding. I've been to every place he's been because I've been most places anyway. And I talk to people in all these places, and he just treats people. He's very concerned about people. He remembers the name of a driver from 20 years earlier, or a person's child from 30 years before. So I was very impressed with him as a person, and very serious. He always asked, he asked people, what are they farming? What are they growing? How is their family? How's their finances? How's their health? And the same with me when I had dinner in 2001. He asked me very seriously, he's not like a politician. He asked me very seriously, is there any problems I'm facing? Do I need any help with anything? And finally, I did have one issue at the time, so I just kind of whispered it to him. He thought about it, and then he told me what he thought, and it was pretty smart. So it just amazes me as a down-to-earth person.
Well, I've noticed researching you, you've published about 20 books, unless I missed some more. So I was wondering, is Xi Jinping's encouraging you to write about China as your second home? Did that have a dramatic influence on your life's trajectory?
Yeah, pretty much, because I've been writing all along. I mean, I started writing letters when I first got here, and then I started writing magazine articles and traveling, because some foreigners accused me and said, "You say China's developing, China's doing this good, but it's just on the coast in the inland, the remote areas, it's not developing." I said, "How do you know? You haven't been there." They said, "You haven't been there either." And I said, "Huh, you have a point." So I traveled around and wrote articles. So I wrote textbooks, and I wrote a book about Xiamen because I love Xiamen and I got tired of answering the same questions. So really, that's a personal reason for writing the book. But when Xi Jinping encouraged me to write about Quanzhou, I'd been to Quanzhou so many times, but I didn't know the rich history of Quanzhou. And it's the Maritime Silk Road, and Columbus' goal was to get a shortcut to China, which was Quanzhou. Marco Polo sailed from there. And as I learned more about Fujian history and then China's history, I was amazed. So Xi Jinping encouraging me to write about Quanzhou got me learning more about Chinese history and culture, because he's a bookworm. I mean, he reads all the time. He reads everything. So that got me interested. So then I started writing more. One book wasn't enough. I wrote a book about Fujian, and then I made 62-part TV series. I wrote about Fujian and filmed it. And so he got me started writing it, and I love it. It's just, now I'm addicted to Chinese history and culture. It's just in the arts. But in 2019, I sent him my newest book, Off the Wall, Why We Fell for China, because he's the one that encouraged me to write more books. So I sent him the book and a letter, but I never expected he'd receive it. And I really never expected he'd reply. And in his reply, I thought, at that time I'd written about 12 or 14 books. Now it's 22, I think. But I felt I've done pretty good. He suggested I write. I've written a dozen books. He should be happy. In his book, he said he knows that in the future I'll write even better Chinese stories. I thought, well, thank
Wow.
you. That means keep writing.
Yeah, you have more work to do, Professor.
Keep going.
I
But
want
he's
to
a
tell a
writer
funny
himself.
story.
I like to tell my friends that I have a
Yeah,
book here that was hard to find, but he's a storyteller, and he wrote a book about Zhengding when he was a young leader there, and
this is my
he
favorite book by
encouraged him to
Xi.
write about their history and the past and all that, and I took 2,000 yen to find the original copy with his preface in it.
Wow. Actually, I really like this book by Xi Jinping. It's Zhejiang, China, a New Vision for Development. I have several of his new books, but I really like this one. What's really a funny story for me personally? I ordered your book, and for some reason, I can't figure out why. They sent me two.
Didn't you too?
Yeah, JD sent me two books when I ordered one, so I'm really kind of confused about that. I'm still trying to figure that out.
Well, I
So
think it's because they can't sell them, so they're trying to get rid
I
of
don't
them.
think that's it. I think there was some sort of like digital error or something. But now I have to. So when we meet in the future, Professor, I'm going to insist that you sign the nicer one that I've left in the plastic. All right. So this is unusual. Most foreigners who come to China intend to live here a year or two, and some end up living many years. But you've lived here 36 years, and moreover, you have mentioned on more than one occasion that you have chosen to stay in China for the rest of your life. And in fact, I think you said until they bury me somewhere. So, could you
Yeah.
tell us why you've decided to make China your lifelong home?
Well, the thing is I've been to over 30 something countries. I've traveled a lot. I love traveling, and when I came here, I only wanted to study for 1 or 2 years, and then I didn't know what I wanted to do, probably leave. And I never imagined being a teacher. I kind of got hornswoggled into that. They asked me to just teach 1 year. They asked me to teach because the American teacher here left suddenly. And I said, no, I came here to study Chinese, not teach. They said, just 1 year? And I said, no, I gave up my company to come here to teach? No. They said, 1 year, and then you can study. I said, okay. And after 1 year, they said, well, how about just two? I said, okay, but no more. And then they said three. But by then I was hooked because I love teaching business. I never thought of doing that. But China's goal back then was to develop economically, develop peacefully, which requires understanding international business. And I thought this is pretty strategic. I mean, if China is going to develop peacefully and economically, they need to learn international business and these things. And it's also good for my country because I'd rather my country have a business relationship China with China than a military relationship. So I felt like, well, this is something very useful. Teaching business is helpful, and the countries help fight poverty, but it needs money, business for that. So I thought, what else could I do that's to me more meaningful? So why go back to the U.S., go back into business again? I didn't want to start a new business, but go back into business again and work for another 30, 40, 50 years. Well, I love seeing the changes. I love seeing the generations. I teach graduate students, and one of my graduate students now is the child of a graduate student from 35 years ago. Um, so very early, I said I want to stay in China all my life. My wife wasn't sure, but about 3.5 years ago, she finally said to me one day, she said, I agree with you. This is where I want to stay the rest of my life. I felt so good about that. And I thought, well, okay, then this is where we're
You
staying.
convinced her. Well, I guess
I
her
convinced
lifestyle
her.
here convinced her.
Yeah.
It's a very safe feeling when you walk down the streets in China. There's no concern, no worry about safety. And I think that's
Yeah.
one of the things that really makes it easy to live here for me. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, which you've already touched on this. China has been working on poverty alleviation for a
Yeah.
long time. And they
Long
did
time.
meet one of their goals in 2020, and now they've changed
Yeah.
their goals to common prosperity from
Hmm.
anti-poverty alleviation. And you've written more than one book on this. And one of them is called The Evolution of China's Anti-Poverty Strategies, Cases of 20 Chinese Changing Lives. Could you tell us a little bit about China's anti-poverty campaign and how it has enhanced the lives of regular people here?
Yeah. That's to me, I was fascinated with that because when I was in high school, I actually thought I'd go to Latin America and help poor farmers there. And I've been to, some poor areas. but I never imagined China, with the world's largest population and so much poverty, could help so many people. And I read I think it's one of the world government groups that said from 1990 to 2005, I think it was, at 15 years, something like 2/3 of the poverty alleviation in the world was from China. And it really, I was still skeptical. So in 94, I drove with my wife and two kids 40,000 miles around China to Tibet,
Wow.
Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, Tibet. Back then, there weren't good roads. It took me 4 months to do the drive, but I wanted to go. I went to the remotest places to see what they were doing. And I was so impressed because, again, like the urban development and being very practical and scientific, it's such a practical thing. They had this motto: roads first, then riches. 要想富先修路. Roads first, then riches. Very practical, because these people were in such poor areas. I've been to some of them. It would take them 2 days to walk out of the valley they were in. If they grew fruit or crops or something, by the time they got to market, it was spoiled. And so they were just so desperately poor. So they were building new roads even in 93, 94 when I was driving around China. But when I drove around again in 2019 to see the changes in 25 years, it was absolutely incredible. I had some of the Xiamen University people go with me. And in the remotest places, Ningxia, 30 years ago, UNESCO rep said there was no hope for them. There's nothing that can be done. But Xi Jinping, as a young provincial leader in the 90s, took a team there to see them, and even then had some ideas that helped them out. But every place, Inner Mongolia, now they have roads to the poorest, to the remotest places. And one of the women there, she has a business. She makes traditional dairy snacks and sells them to tourists. And she's made enough money to send her daughter to Xiamen University. And then she became a graduate student. And they were so desperately poor that when she told us our story of 30 years ago, I mean, we almost cried. She did cry while she was telling the story. And in Tibet, remote Tibetan valleys, these people there doing e-commerce, remote Tibetan valley. And that's helping their economy, but they're also promoting their Tibetan culture by doing a lot of things with e-commerce. And every province I've been to, the most remote areas, it's just they've helped these people. But what's really amazing to me, what makes China different, and I've given a couple talks about this, written about it, is not just the incredible complexity of the plans at different levels, but how do you get to the poorest people? That's something they've been working on for a long time. How do you get to the poorest villages, the poorest families? And I developed a term that I used in one of my books. I call it barefoot secretaries, because 50 years ago they had barefoot farmers. Barefoot farmers. Yeah, they have that. Barefoot doctors. 50 years ago, they had barefoot doctors all over China, and to the poorest places. And they call them barefoot because they live with the people that they serve. But Xi Jinping, when he was in Fujian, the poorest area, Ningda, North Fujian, in 1988 to 1990, very poor area, he went to every village, every place, and talked to the people, found out the problems, what are they doing, how to help them. And that reminded me of the barefoot doctors, so I call it barefoot secretaries. And China has tens of thousands of barefoot secretaries, which are basically volunteers who have skills and background, and they volunteer for 3 years in the poorest areas. And like in Yunnan or Tibet, the 5,000-meter death zone of Tibet, a man from Beijing, where you live, 3 years volunteered for there. And he's helped them with their medical care, their education, their economic development, but it's enlarged his heart. There's no healing for it now. It's hurt his memory, his sleep. He can't sleep. And now when he goes back to Beijing to visit, there's no hope for his health, and he stays on there. And I've seen people like this all over China. And this is what's amazing, because you can have the best plans in the world, but how do you get to the very bottom? That's something China's developed and evolved over 70 years. And the reason they've been able to do so well in China is that it's both top down and bottom up. Bottom up volunteers, bottom up entrepreneurs, like a lady I knew who wanted to come to Xiamen University, not to be a student, but to be a maid for a professor, because she had 4 years education from the countryside. Today, she has 4 international schools, a biotechnology company, and she's given hundreds of millions of yuan to fight poverty. So those are amazing to see those kind of stories.
Well, the combination of roads with digital e-commerce and making local goods seems like a very good win, because essentially someone in these remote areas would be able to make their goods, sell them on the internet, and then ship them on those roads. So that makes a lot of sense. You
Yeah.
mentioned 20, you mentioned, I mean, your book mentions cases of 20 Chinese changing lives. Could you tell us one or two that really stuck out to you about how they transform their lives?
Okay. One of them, when I drove around China in 2019, it took 32 days instead of 3 months and 20,000 kilometers instead of 40. But um, one of those, the reason is because of the bridges and tunnels, as well as the good roads. And that's a good example of one of the lives that changed. Um, this young guy that um, he didn't wear shoes until he was a teenager. They were so poor. He went to school for
Wow.
4 years, and then he did heavy labor, and then he dug tunnels, and that's backbreaking work. And as he's doing it, he thought, I could do this better. And there's better ways to do this. So he got some of his friends from his hometown to work together, get a contract, and they built a tunnel and did a good job. And then he got a bigger contract and a bigger contract. And then he started ordering books from the US and other countries and having them translated into Chinese so he could read them. And over time, he learned more and he developed. And so he's built over 70 tunnels around China now. The highest
Wow.
railway tunnel in the world in Tibet, he did that. The first undersea tunnel in China here in Xiamen, he did that. And
Wow.
and he was able to build this, to learn this and build it because of the uh, just the opportunities that China had given them. And like my friend who was the maid and became the multimillionaire, a lot of my friends who became successful, he's used his money to help fight poverty, to help rural education, but also cultural things. He only has 4 years education, but he's filmed documentaries, cultural and historical documentaries. He's opened museums, including a China museum in Japan. And
Wow.
it's just amazing to see stories like this. And I could give you a dozen stories like this, but then there's others like the woman who lived so poorly in Inner Mongolia that family member died and they didn't have good health, education, all that. And then now just doing dairy snacks, she can send her daughter to college. Or
Yeah.
and then there's stories like the lady in Northeast China who went out to the very west, Gansu, the poor area near the Gobi Desert, and stayed there like 20, 30 years, I think it is. She stayed there long from her family just to, as a teacher, helping children and giving most of her income back to the children to help them. She's given something like 200,000 yuan as a poor teacher. So all
Wow.
over China, it's just amazing stories. I could write 10 books about these stories.
Man, with you, I think you might have to, sir. Those are wonderful stories. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to know how your teaching graduate level business coincides with your interest in poverty alleviation, because clearly there's a link between business and becoming more prosperous.
Yeah, this has really hit me in the past few years. But one, teaching business, I decided to stick with that because, again, if China's going to fight poverty, it needs money. As Confucius once said, no money, no honey. He didn't say that. Chinese say, when did he say that? I say that's in the foreign edition.
I was gonna have to check that
So,
later.
but so it need business is fundamental to be able to do all these things. But now that China's developing pretty well, there's still issues that for poverty alleviation or for the rural development now that they're focusing on. For example, 30 years ago, they said roads first, then riches. Now they have roads. The remotest places I've gone to, they have roads. But just because they have roads doesn't mean they know how to use those roads. So, for example, a lot of my students, the business students at Xiamen University, they go together, for example, to Ningxia, the really poor area, or even poor areas in Fujian. Well, this is Coco. Hello, Coco.
Hi.
And they go to these poor areas, and like there's tea farmers. Fujian is famous for tea. So there's
Mhm.
farmers in Fujian, not too far from us in the mountains. They grow this prize-winning tea. They go to fairs that win these awards for this tea, but they can't market it. Farmers don't know how to market it or distribute it and all this. So they also grow rice and grow other things just to survive, but they have all these awards on the walls for this tea. but they don't have any money.
Mm.
So we have a team of Xiamen University students go there, and the business students know how to do the marketing. We get the legal department, lawyers in the university to give us ideas on the laws and on the copyrights, the trademarks and these kind of things. The chemistry departments help us expertise on the soil and
Wow.
improving the soil, the quality and these kind of things. There's so many things to be considered. So,
Mhm.
so I have a new motto. I tell my students, say, first roads first, then riches. But now we have to tell these farmers how to use those roads. And one farmer in a very remote area about 2 years ago, he said, we need you university students to help us. He said, this opportunity, but we don't know what to do. So the
Well,
university is very important.
that's so beautiful that you and your students and the university students at Xiamen are reaching out to these communities and providing technical and vocational training to help these farmers essentially turn their farms into more profitable industry. That's really really quite beautiful. I'm touched by that. I wanted to briefly talk about China's Belt and Road and ask you about that. China's
Oh,
Belt and
what?
Road includes
Oh,
China's Belt and Road
yeah.
Initiative,
Help me. Yeah.
which includes more than 150 countries around the world, which is like three-quarters of all countries now. What kinds of tools that has China developed for poverty alleviation that you think might be useful in transforming other areas around the world, maybe Latin America, which you were mentioning before, in terms of turning it around there and helping with poverty alleviation elsewhere in the world?
Well, first, I like to say I have lots of friends from Africa, and my youngest son is in Africa with his wife and 3 kids doing volunteer medical work and
Wow.
helping dig wells. And he said, in the remotest, poorest areas, you see Chinese. And what are they doing? They're building roads and highways and dams and ports and airport and all these things. And but where did they get why are they doing that? They're doing the exact same thing in Africa and other places now that they did in China. 30 years ago, it's a very simple but pragmatic idea. Roads first, build the infrastructure, the foundation, then build upon that. And so Belt and Road is basically the same thing. Roads first, then riches, but exported. And they're using their experience and their success. They proved what it did in China. And now they're doing that in other countries. And my son was very excited to see Chinese in the remote area. I asked him, I said, aren't you worried taking my 3 grandchildren to Africa? Is this dangerous there? He said, I'm not worried about the danger of that, but he said, I'm worried, can I eat? Because both of my sons love to make Chinese food. He said, I don't know if I can find stuff to cook Chinese food. And after he'd been there just a few days, he said, Dad, there's Chinese everywhere. We can eat. So this Belt and Road Initiative, I have so many friends here in Xiamen University, a lot of African students. And they are so grateful that China is there. The thing is a lot of people don't understand that China, even in the 1960s, China was helping Africa. When China was so poor, China was helping Africa build railways. And of course, Western media says, well, they made a lot of mistakes. They did, but at least they tried. People don't know that Africa is so big that you can take the United States, Europe, and China and put inside Africa. It's that big.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the most resource-rich place on the entire planet. It's the richest place on the planet, and yet it's the poorest. They had something like in 1980, I think 1.4% of global manufacturing, 1.4%. And 20 years later, it was even less. But then it went up to 1.5, which is a little bit better because China is helping them build the infrastructure. And I know a lot of people say, China's this or this or this or this or this. There's a lot of talk about the Belt and Road. But my Chinese friends, my African friends are very thankful that China's there because a lot of countries talk about what they can do in Africa and we will do this for you and we will do this and we will do this. But it's been 100 years that Africa has been in such dire straits. And China now is just very, just like at home, very pragmatically, they're building the infrastructure. And not just roads and this, they're even building industrial complexes. So Western businesses, Western American and European companies can go there and build factories, and China has prepared infrastructure for that. So it's incredible what they're doing.
Yeah, I've seen some of the work through American institutions. The College of William and Mary has a website called Aid Data, where it talks about some of the infrastructure that China is building with African partners, including, hydropower dams and so forth, which you need if you're going to have factories. So
Yeah,
China is actually taking the first steps to enabling the rest of the infrastructure to be built, because without those hydropower dams and other energy facilities as well, some of them fossil fuel emitting, but that's required in some cases and increasingly less so needed. That electricity is going to go to helping develop some of these countries and raising the standard of living. So it is really amazing to see that. I wanted to ask a different question before I ask the next question that I kind of had planned. Do you go back to the States? And if so, having lived in China so long, what is your experience of returning? Do you get culture shock?
um, well, I don't go back often, um, especially now. I mentioned earlier that my wife said that she wanted to live in China the rest of her life.
Right.
But what I didn't say was that 2 months later she had a heart attack and left.
Oh,
But so she
I'm
is
sorry.
in China for the rest of her life now. But that was really moving to me that 2 months before she had that heart attack, she said that. So so she's still here. She's on a hillside, not too far from China.
Mm.
So now I pretty much stay here. But when I do go back and visit, I did go back last Christmas. I in 36 years, I've only been in America 2 times for Christmas. So I wanted to go back for Christmas. I know it's commercial and all that, but I love the liveliness of it.
Mm.
And I love going back to America. I love it's a beautiful country. I like the people. I love driving around America. Always have. Last December, in 4 weeks, I drove 5,000 miles in 4 weeks, just
Wow.
visiting places. I didn't take the plane. I wanted to drive it and see it for myself. So I love
Yeah.
America. I love a lot about the culture. I love the diversity. Um, but after 36 years in China, um, this really does feel like home. I
Mm.
feel like I'm doing something useful here.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so I don't really feel culture shock in the US, except the culture that generational culture, maybe everything's changing. But
Sure.
but I like it here. This is where I'm working. This is where I'm doing something useful. Lots of friends, family. So yeah.
We began the interview talking about 1988, how you thought back home or in the West generally, there were misconceptions about the way that China was. And so you began writing letters to people back home to let them know what China really was like, as opposed to the perceptions that people had developed about what life in China might be like. We're here in 2024. And if you read, American media, you know that there is a certain way that China is often represented. And of course, you live here, so you know what China is really like. What do you, in your assessment, does the West get wrong about China that you would like people back home to know about how China really is?
Well, I think it's such a fundamental, big difference. I saw this from the very first couple of weeks here. Things that I knew happened personally, the first year here. Things that I knew happened personally in the when they were presented in the Western media, very different, completely different. And I was shocked because I always assumed that the news was objective and accurate. I think it was Walter Cronkite used to say, and that's the way it is. And when he said that, I believe that's the way it is. Nowadays, it's so many of my American friends, though, they say, wow, I just read this about China and that about China and this about China. And they talk about a lot of the problems. And here's the thing, a lot of the things the Western media says about China, a lot of the things are true. There are these real problems. But the thing is, one of the best ways to mislead people is don't lie. If you lie to people, they can pretty much prove you lied, but don't lie, just tell part of the truth. And you can't disprove that. So they talk about these problems that China have, but they don't talk about how far it is improved or what the goals are. And they also don't talk about that a lot of these problems they talk about China, that China does have, that Western countries have the same problems.
Mhm.
US has similar problems. And often a lot of the problems they talk about in China, the US may not have it or Europe may not have it, but they create these problems in Africa or Latin America. So it's very, very biased and very political. And I didn't realize that at first. I was very surprised. Of course, now, so when my friends talk about China now, I said, do you believe that? I said, why not? I said, well, do you believe everything CNN says about Trump? Do you believe everything that Fox says about Biden? Well, then why do you believe what either one of them says about China? It's the same thing. Really, I mean, really, it's amazing. Every day I look at the news and you can see the same event, but whether it's from the left or the right, completely different. So the problem, but China, the big thing they talk about China is a lot of people really have the idea, even now, is that China's like the 70s and that, like it's this really heavy-handed government that controls everything. Biden saying some leader in China is a dictator and authoritarian and all this kind of thing. But I think what they don't understand is that, and they say it's not a democracy. Well, I'm not so sure that having only one party is necessarily not a democracy, just like I'm not sure that having two parties is a democracy. It's more complicated than that. And I forgot what I was going to say there. Oh, the people here respect their leaders. So a lot of my friends in America feel like the leaders of China are just controlling the people. But in traveling all around China, in 2019, when I traveled around China, I asked a lot of the people in the different provinces, why has life improved so much in the past 10 years? In different provinces, I had so many people, farmers, fishermen, different people say, because good government policies. And I said, okay, but why are the government policies good? And I had at least a dozen say it, similar words. They said, because the government cares for us. I said, wow. I said, but how do they even know what your needs are? And they said, because they said the government knows for us, and 4 or 5 of them said Xi Jinping cares for us. And how does he know? You know, when I was driving around China, these leaders work so hard. When I was driving around China after 2019, I went to so many places, and I was beginning to feel cocky, proud. I've been to all these places, but you know what? Almost every place I went, I saw photos of Xi Jinping. But he didn't go there like me. The Chinese say, looking at flowers on horseback, just passing through. He went to all these places, but to see what are the problems, what are the needs, what can they do to help. And then he doesn't know everything, but once he knew the problems, then he'd get together a team of experts and get their advice. And he did this from when he was in his 20s, when he's first starting out. So this is, to me, real leadership. And it's, an Englishman wrote in South China Morning Post a few years ago. I don't think he meant it to be positive, but I thought it was good. He said the biggest difference between China and the United States is not that one is socialist and one is capitalist, but that one is run by lawyers and the other is run by engineers. I thought that's pretty good. Actually, I like that. And I think I would rather have a country run by engineers who use some science and logic to solve problems. And China's been like this a long time. In the year 1 AD, China population was almost 60 million people in the year 1 AD. And with 60 million people, you can't just play politics. You have to use logic and science to take care of people. So I think it would be good if the Western country, other countries could learn to understand why China does things the way they do and understand it's not necessarily inferior or different. It's not necessarily less democratic. I watched Xi Jinping go from the bottom almost to the top. And he went up because he did a very good job at every level. And that's how the other leaders I know work. They do a very good job, they move up. It doesn't matter. It's not just guanxi or relationships. They do a good job, they move up. They don't do a good job, they don't move up. They do a bad job, it's bye-bye. So I think it's a pretty good system.
I try to make that point to people also, because, you know, if they're given a small village to like sort of improve, they have metrics. If those metrics improve, they're given a slightly bigger village. And it just kind of keeps going like that. So you have the most capable people who are able to change those metrics in a meaningful way. But I want to move on. My last question.
Well, one other real quick. A lot of people don't know. Please. Harvard Business Review in 2014 said that before the 19th century, this is March 2014, before the 19th century, China's economy was more open and more market-driven than the economies of Europe. That's Harvard Business Review. So China has been doing a good job for a long time.
My last question I like to ask every guest that I have on, because ultimately what we're trying to do here is build bridges between the West and China, and increase and deepen understanding, is what do you think, and you kind of touched on this earlier, have a business relationship with China instead of a military relationship. But what do you think, in your opinion, can deepen cross-cultural understanding between the people of the US and the people of China?
I think the most important thing, what really changed my mind, was coming here.
Hmm.
Uh, but most people aren't going to come here. I know that. But from the very beginning, I've encouraged other young Americans. Now I'm not so young, but then I encourage them to come to either study Chinese here, study Chinese back home, or study Chinese here, and to learn more about the culture. Because the thing is, I try to get young people to do like a gap year in China, because I tell them in today's world, it doesn't matter what your career goals are. If you understand a little Chinese, that's pretty useful, because in this world, China and the U.S. are big powers, and it's important to get to know them. And but people look at China as the enemy. I said that's even all the more reason to learn Chinese. Sun Tzu says, "Know yourself, know your enemy." And a lot of government leaders in America have written recently, even VOA mentioned it once, that we don't have China experts like we did 20, 30 years ago because of this so-called decoupling. And so I think that we need to get more people learning Chinese and learning about the culture. Um, in the US, I was very happy when my small hometown of 15,000 people had high school Chinese. So I think that that's important. Um, and Xi Jinping last November at APEC in San Francisco said he had a goal of 50,000
Yeah.
Americans studying Chinese in the next 5 years. But it's not the first time that goal happened. 2009, I think it was, Obama had his thing of 100,000 Americans studying in China. That was his goal.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
2 or 3 years later, it was on track. But because of a lot of other things, kind of fell apart. But I think that's very important. We need a new generation of people who understand each other, because right
Mhm.
now we really have, I mean, a lot of reports have been on this recently, that we have lost a generation of people with feet on the ground in China, young people who will be the China watchers, the China hands of the future. We're losing that. And it's going to get worse if we have nobody that understands China. So I think it's very important that we try to build a small team, at least, of Americans who really understand China, whether as friends or foe, it doesn't matter, but understand China.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Thank you so much for your time, Professor William Brown.